As scary as night flying may be, and has diminished your observation range, it also makes for a fun, different gameplay experience from what you do in the daytime, if you respect the limitations. While flare bombs from say an A-10 will light up the sky like the sun, sometimes you gotta do it yourself, or rotate duties of using illumination rockets so the rest of you can rain down hell. This video is specifically about how to loft the S-8OM illumination rockets as accurately as possible. Now I can't stress this enough, there's a wide range of parameters that'll be good enough. So inaccuracies in your instruments, ranging or guesstimate target point, exact attitude and pitch changes while you fire, wind drift, targets moving, all of these can stack up and you can still get enough light. I'm trying to give you the baseline of what might be the perfect parameters, which thus is something you can aim for. It also depends on whether you want max illumination time or coverage. Want the light to be behind the target, making them contrast or light up their front facing. If you want light just enough to see targets, or do you want it bright enough for a contrast lock? Now the S-8OM illumination rockets deploy their flares 16 seconds after launch. The flares last 35 seconds each, apparently 2 million candela brightness, so the trick is to loft it correctly. Too high and you don't get the ground targets illuminated enough. Too low and the flare goes out, despawning as it touches the ground. And usually you want it above the target area. So there's a set distance and angle, and about all you can do is change your pitch a little, which either has it flare but closer with less light on the ground, or lower pitch which has it go slightly further but might snuff out early. Clearly, this won't help much trying to go hunt a killer in the dark unless you first happen to spot something out your night vision goggles, or after tweaking a Shkval like downing the contrast and upping the brightness say, until you might see something. It's more for lighting up an area where you're expecting targets, like a nav target point or daylink target set to ingress. This way you get a ranging on the HUD. You could also approach it with waypoints or even some point you've hooked and set to a 2 in the abris. Or of course spotting traces coming from the dirt, laser ranging the area, as long as you have a decent idea of the distance to the target area you're trying to light up, and either get a heading from the abris or HUD, or you can see it. You can do this in forward flight, especially if you know there's little threat, and you're following up with rockets on another pylon selection. See my video on weapon selection and jettisoning, which also covers asymmetric rockets. And you need to coordinate with other shocks if you're lighting up for them in terms of your timing. Just note with this pitch up, you'll need to lower collective if you don't want to climb rapidly. Now if you want or need continuous illumination of the area, or want to maintain standoff, then doing this from a hover is easier. Since you'll be pitching up, you'll start flying backwards, so ensure the area behind you is free of obstacles. Hover hold might help you slowly float back to the original point if you didn't pitch up for too long. But otherwise, a hover can help you maintain position and that distance to the target area and won't lead to you climbing, so you're ready for the next volley to provide continuous light. To fire them, the usual stuff of weapons power, master arm on, and the correct rocket pylon selected. While the S-8OM illumination rockets are visibly longer with the white caps being more prominent in the tubes, they have the same ballistic profile as the S-8OM rockets. So ballistic setting 0 on the shock, although this is giving an impact point, which isn't that useful for gauging the desired airburst. Finally, you're going to pitch up quite a bit. If your Shkval is uncaged, so screen lit up and pointing somewhere, then typically the pitch up and you'll lose the C shoot cue and be unable to fire. This isn't a problem if the Shkval is still caged, but if it is uncaged and you've laser ranged an area, maybe you're trying to fire on it next, then make sure that you're on manual mode so these automatic mode constraints when you pitch up don't apply. Now, big thanks to Sail for highlighting that these angles and distances have changed. Probably when ED modified the rocket parameters more recent-ishly. Also thanks to Mia for testing. The recommended trajectory used to be pitching up from 3.7 kilometers. ED manual for the Shark now recommends firing 15 to 20 degrees pitch up from 7 kilometers. But even at 250 kilometers per hour airspeed from 420 meters above the ground, pitch up 15 degrees, the rockets would always fall short by about 250 meters. I mean, it'll lap the area, but not the best placement. Firing it at 15 degrees from 5.9 kilometers is where it's at the moment. That angle about stays the same for most of the lower altitudes, so nap of the Earth, or maybe if you don't want to reverse into things, 60 meters above ground might clear most treetops. Maybe reduce this pitch slightly if you're at 300 meters above ground or more. Pull back on the cyclic until the datum lines up with 15 degrees, then fire. Importantly, the rockets don't clear the tubes the instant you press fire. So any upward or downward pitching momentum your fuselage has will be imparted to those rockets, as well as changing the pitch when they finally clear the tube. So really, you're pulling back cyclic and then reducing its input just before you reach 15 degrees so it gradually slows down, and then adjusting input again so that it stays stable at that 15 degrees for a moment while you launch. Then you can pitch down again. Just note, some of this footage I was convinced that it was 6 kilometers range being the best. I've since refined it to 5.9, but as you can see, a lot of the shots that I'll be showing from 6K's range work out just fine. Wind drastically affects things. Folding fin rockets usually want to turn into the oncoming wind. So a crosswind from the left will make the rockets veer left. However, the flares themselves get blown much further to the right once the chute opens. So you have to correct for this by turning into the crosswind even more, so the flares average out their journey flying over the target area. You can see the current wind conditions at your aircraft's position by pushing the wind disk button, which shows the wind speed in meters per second and the direction the wind is coming from. My rule of thumb would be changing a heading into the crosswind for the release by 1 degree per 4 meters, or almost 8 knots of crosswind. Take note of the heading you release at so that you can correct on the second volley based on what you see. Since a 1 degree change can be hard to see, and since the Shark wind corrects the pipper, one option is that if you have the Shkval uncaged, so the pipper stays in sight at the default 1.1 kilometers ranging. Now change your heading so the target reticle is about a quarter the distance that the pipper is from the center of your datum on the other side. So datum in the middle, target on the one side, and 4 times that distance on the other side is the rocket pipper. This lets you compensate a little better for the flare drift. Now, unfortunately, your pipper won't adjust for head or tailwind. Well, not that you can use really. Say with this strong tailwind of 15 meters per second, or 29 knots, firing the normal 15 degrees overshoots the deployment and then keeps drifting or losing light over the targets fairly quickly. Firing at a higher angle gets it in a better spot, but now the flares are high up and providing poor light. So best to fix it with your distance to the target area. The easiest rule of thumb I've come up with is for every 3 meters per second of tailwind, be 100 meters further back. Or for every 3 meters per second headwind, be 100 meters ahead of the 5.9K mark. Now if it's a strong diagonal wind, fudge something between these tips, fire, observe, correct. Either way, as I mentioned, there's much leeway here, and the instruments are showing a range is only up to 100 meters, even if you have the target area perfectly sighted and ranged. You could probably go ludicrous speed stratospherically high and fire almost level from further out and get it spot on. If the area is dangerous, consider firing from further out. Then if there's an advance threats further forward from the target area, then you can spot them early. And you might still get enough light on the actual target area. If you want to stretch out the illumination time, firing only a single rocket from each rocket pod at a time, then spacing your volleys 35 seconds apart, you can squeeze out just over 11.6 minutes of illumination per set of rocket pods firing simultaneously. That said, if you're responsible for continuous illumination without gaps, maybe in a hover hold, start pitching up every 32 seconds, so by the time you fire and those rockets pop, the previous ones haven't gone out just yet. Then, while counting down, you slip back forwards into your original position. Note, I said for each firing, so whether it's firing a single rocket, a pair, 3 or 4, but either way, only one rocket per pod firing. That's for stretching it out. Now the question is, how many rockets? Note this mission, the sun and moon are both below the horizon, and the targets are far enough away that the cultural lighting from the cities and highways don't affect them. Your nighttime might still have a little more light. More rockets in a space will brighten up everything more and extend the radius of the light, but if you want a wider area coverage for the same amount of rockets, it's better to space them out in terms of distance. Some examples, both the external view as well as the Shark's Shkval with max brightness and tweaking the contrast of the screen until one can just make out a vehicle with zero illumination at 6Ks. Firing a single rocket from a single pod with a flare above a tank and optimal height, the targets are very well lit, enough so the Shkval can contrast lock a bit later as the flare descends closer. The targets 500 meters away from that spot are fairly well visible. 1 kilometer out isn't pitch black yet, but very hard to see. If you launched a pair of rockets at the same time, the 1 kilometer target isn't clear, but is much more visible. My gamma is the default 2.2. With 4 pairs, so 8 rockets, you can slightly make out targets at 1.5 kilometers away from the spot where the flares pop. If you don't need more brightness to find the targets or get a contrast lock with a shark, which is only effective if there's moving targets and you don't want to manually slew the missile onto or guess the lead, then spreading the rockets in location and maybe timing will extend how much light you'll get from your rockets. Changing your heading by 15 degrees per launch seems to be a good spread to keep a wider area lit well enough. You could push it a little further if you're launching more than singles, but 15 is fair. Just coordinate with wingmen. Spreading coverage means that there could be interruptions in some areas being lit as you yaw back. I think trying to fire at 3 different angles might be pushing it. Changing your launch pitch won't change the depth of the flares much without compromising the light quality or time. You pretty much have to be closer or further back to efficiently change the depth of what you're lighting up. So forward flight if you want, or maybe hovering, pitching up for longer enough will change the depth of the flares in terms of forwards, backwards. For the shark to get a contrast lock, I don't think it makes a difference in the game whether you're lighting up the target's side facing you or silhouetting it from behind. It's just whether there's enough light close enough. If you get a vehicle burning, the fire will give a little bit of light around it. Probably not enough to lock something, but enough for you to spot other targets nearby. What I've shown as yet has been short burst mode, firing single rockets or single pairs, mostly. I tap weapon release to get out more. Since this is from a hover, smoke congestion is a thing. If I held on weapon release in a longer burst setting, then 20 rockets is fairly likely to choke out both engines. However, by tapping out 10 pairs, by squeezing the trigger in rapid taps, I could get off 20 with an RPM drop, but not having had the engines die. However, this needs to be done very carefully and probably isn't necessary to have nearly that much light unless you wanted to troll another player in that area running high gamma or night vision goggles. As I said, there's a large measure of good enough, usually with the pitch angle and distance, but this would be the starting point. From there's also some practice you'll need from night flying in general to coordinate the illuminating helo with those doing the shooting, if it's not you soloing it. Remember, for the shark, static targets are easy. If you gain a laser ranging on the target, your vigor and unguided munitions will still land on target even in the pitch black. If you're dealing with more scripted or more player controlled ground forces, then you might be on the clock after the first flare lights up. So plot out your advance, who's doing illumination, how, when, possibly in larger bursts. Moving targets get more tricky if you can't lock them up. Final note, while the S-8OMs are the same on the hip and the hind, there are numerous differences on how it's mounted, bursts, how it fires, and how you could use your instruments. In short, 5.9 kilometers 15 degrees is good enough there as well, though I might make a dedicated video covering that later. Maybe. This is Volk. Happy hunting.